Welcome back to the Backslider Diaries, the podcast for the faithful, the frustrated, and everyone caught somewhere between a pulpit and a panic attack. I'm T.
And I'm Jay, and we're glad to have you here. First off, we wanted to say sorry. It's been so long since our last episode, but things being what they are, I got sick and had pneumonia and decided to spare you all from hearing me cough up a lung over the interwebs. So we are back, happy to be here. And today we are very, very honored and happy to have a wonderful special guest. Today we have in the studio with us a dear friend that we've known for a long, long, long time. We were just talking about how long we've known each other, but Lance is here with us. So Lance, welcome.
Hey, thank you. It's good to hear your voice finally. It's been a
Yeah,
while.
it's been, let's see, I'm not going to say how old any of us are, but let's just
Friends was
say,
probably on TV.
yeah, Friends was probably on, and it's a
Oh, way before.
pre-syndication. The last time we saw each other. Uh, I'm trying to
Yeah.
think. Let's see. We've known each other since, gosh, what,
Since
85?
before I had a TV, by the way. Since
Dude,
bef-
since before any of us had a TV. It was the devil.
Well, I
But
know I
yeah.
was able to drive because I made it from, I'm not going to say where it was, Lance's town to our town in record time one night. And
eh.
I got in trouble because I made it way too fast.
So, by way of background, Lance and T and I all grew up in the same faith tradition. We all grew up in were you Pentecostal background, or did you come from Assemblies of God
No,
originally?
we were always considered independent. We didn't
Okay.
join the organization, but
Yeah.
it's,
We got
belief-wise, it
kicked
was the
out.
same. It was the
So,
same. It was the same.
same
So,
flavor, different ice cream, right?
yeah.
Um, so yeah, we've known each other since we were kids. T, you,
Mhm.
I think, were a young teenager. I was a preteen when we first met. In fact, I think I remember the first time that we met because I recalled your mother as having the most beautiful blue eyes I'd ever seen in my entire
Yeah,
life.
believe that. Yeah.
Yep, they were just stunning. And I was like, wow, she looked like a Barbie to me. And I think I was probably 10, maybe 11
Mhm.
when we met.
I
And
think I was
so,
12. I
yeah,
think I was
yeah,
12.
I think that's right, because you're just a
Mhm.
couple
Yeah.
of years older than me.
Yeah.
Because I think you're close to my cousin's age.
Could
My
be.
Yeah, I think you guys were right in the same bracket. But our fathers were both pastors, and as it turned out, they actually wound up kind of co-pastoring for a while. So we really did go through the thick of our Pentecostal teenage identity together. And it's been really interesting kind of growing up and seeing the paths that all three of our lives have taken. And it's definitely been a journey. And we would love to hear if you would like to share some of your story, and feel free to share your background and anything that you'd like to share about.
Yeah, sure. So let me try to hit the milestones, and then I'm sure that'll probably elicit some questions along the way. So I did grow up Pentecostal. My father was a Pentecostal preacher who was also a pastor at some point growing up, and that was a pretty much I was raised in a bubble basically. And you guys can relate to that. I went to church school my whole life. I never went to a public school to speak of, except for kindergarten. I don't count that. So our church school, our church, that was pretty much my whole life. Like I was in the bubble with all the Pentecostal restrictions that you're familiar with as far as not having television, all the dress codes that went along with it. Ours went a little further. Like I wasn't allowed to participate in any team sports or anything like that as
Mhm.
well. No bowling for some reason. I don't know why bowling was always singled out, but it was an issue.
The devil's in the pins.
It was strange, like, I don't like, we were allowed to rent a roller skating rink or something, like, we could do that. No mixed bathing, if anyone under 30 even knows what that term means anymore, like,
You can't swim with the
so,
boys, can't
no
swim with the girls.
shorts, I mean,
Yep.
so lots of things that would really single you out and have you essentially in a bubble, and I didn't know any different. I really didn't. People so this is I'm gonna hit the church stuff first, I guess, and then I'll kinda go back and overlay the other part. So that was my life, and I actually probably have YouTube because I stayed in the Pentecostal church until 2006, so I probably made it a little bit longer.
A little
Um,
bit.
yeah, just a little bit. So I guess what I need to overlay with is in 2016, I came out gay, and that was a big moment in my life after upbringing I had
Congratulations.
in the church. Thank you very much, and happy Pride, by the way.
Happiest
Yeah.
of prides.
Yeah.
And to all
Um,
our listeners who celebrate, happy Pride to you all as well.
I
absolutely.
can't even tell my parents how I feel about religion, much less if I was in your
Yeah.
situation.
No, it's
So, man, that takes some strength right there.
Yeah, I
yeah,
hid my
I
nose
appreciate
ring them from them when I was in my 40s, so to you, yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And honestly, that experience of coming out, like you said, is almost universal in terms of even if you're coming out of sexuality, if you're coming out of Pentecostalism and beliefs, and I mean, there's a very similar experience in terms of the fear and the courage that it takes to be yourself and to be authentic with those that you care about and love. So I think it's a shared experience, even
You know,
beyond
that's
sexuality.
interesting, and not to hijack your story because I wanna go back to that, but that brought up an interesting point. In my journey, I've seen and read and heard so many people use that language
Mhm.
and, not to co-opt the culture, but to kind of borrow from that because there is a lack of language of what do you call it when you're opening up, especially when your whole family is enshrouded in a belief system and you're coming to the table saying, I no longer am this thing that every one of you are. I no longer see the world the way that you have told me to see it. And I'm going to be living my life in a way that you probably are very much not going to agree with based on closely held principles. And I've heard people in deconstruction use that terminology of coming out of the Christian closet.
Sure.
And I think that that's a really interesting perspective from your point of view of seeing that there is some commonality to the experience. So I thought that was interesting. But go ahead with what
Yeah,
you
yeah,
were
yeah.
sharing.
No, all agreed. Yeah. So during that period of just growing up in Pentecostalism and then growing up in the church, it was really my life. Like I just didn't understand even what it meant to be gay. Like people ask me all the time, when did you know? And that's very hard to pinpoint sometimes because, I had thoughts, but in my mind it was lust or some demonic
Mm.
like influence or something along those lines like really to understand what it meant to be gay as an orientation that did not come until later. I just was too isolated and too secluded from any knowledge.
That brings up a question for me. Did you, and you don't have to answer if you're uncomfortable with it, but did you, when you began to awaken to that knowledge of yourself and you were still in the church, did you I guess I'm reflecting back on so many times that any hint of anything sexual, you were supposed to like, come pray for deliverance and ask to be set
Yeah.
free from, whether it was lust for anyone or in any capacity. Did you feel that like burden, so to speak, of I need to be delivered from this? Like was that in your awareness in that construct?
Oh, we could go down a really big rabbit hole there, but just at the top, I will tell you, masturbation was my shame. That
Got
was
you.
just my shame. Like
Yeah,
for years and years and years and years, that was my shame.
that makes
And I
sense. Yeah.
was very hyper focused on that, into teenage years, and so it's just that was it.
You
Mhm.
weren't the only
It
one,
did,
but
yeah, yeah. You become aware of that as adults, but at the time, it's like I am the only one. Oh my god.
Right. No, I had a friend who used to tell me that they used to pray, "God, if you don't want me to do this, why do my hands reach?"
right?
Right. No, so that's how I guess isolated again to the bubble. I just didn't have anything beyond that. I couldn't see past that. And then it wasn't until I guess I was 22 that there was an issue with my parents, and I just remember being accused of being gay at that point. Everything up until that point had been purely like just negative as far as being called a sissy or the F word and all those things like that. Just experienced that because of I look back at video. Yes, my mannerisms. I gave off a gay vibe. Hello. So it's no wonder, like, I encountered that, and I was always trying to overcome that, like, even as an adult, trying to be careful about how I speak, how I use my hands, like, I would sit on my hands sometimes, and so, honestly, coming out has been kinda liberating in that sense. I never have to think about that anymore or
Good.
care about it, so
No, and I hope this comes across with the love that I mean it to come across. But, my husband has also known you since we were teenagers, and when we as adults found out that you had come out and the path your life had taken, we were both so happy. We were like, "Yay!" Because that felt like even though you'd never expressed that part of your identity to us when we were younger, it felt so true, just, like, knowing that for you, it felt like watching someone be free. Do you know what I mean? And when
I
we were
thought, yeah, I thought the
did you feel
same
that way
thing.
too?
When I heard about, you coming out, I was like, man, I bet he is just so relieved and happy and can finally be himself. I couldn't be happier for you.
And
Well, thank
and I
you.
also I think it's important to point out too for people that are listening, we exist in a 2025 world, which although it still has a lot of room to grow, it looks very different. Even in Christian spaces, it looks very different than how it looked in the 80s and the 90s. And I know, for myself, and we grew up in the same world, we didn't know any gay people. Let me rephrase that. I am certain we knew gay people. We didn't know one who was living their gay truth,
Yeah.
right? And even I'm trying to think like there weren't individuals at our church where you could look up and see, oh, okay, that's what that pathway looks like, or and it's not the same thing, but in a similar vein, when I was separating from my first husband and getting ready to go through the divorce process, I didn't have anyone in my family or my immediate church circle or anything like that that had experienced a divorce in that way. And it felt very like
Hmm.
being thrown into a world with no map, no compass, no guidance, and lots of judgment.
Yeah.
Um, so I can only fathom what that felt like for you, but we're interrupting you and I want to hear more about your
No, no, that's
story.
good. No, no, it's true because like you said earlier, I've heard you talk about what was expected of you just being female in our world and the roles that everyone take. I felt that same pressure to be masculine, to act masculine, to kind of fit in with a certain expectation. And part of it was genuine in terms of my desire to have a family, to have children. I mean, all those things were there for me, but I just also knew that I had a pretty substantial issue going into that. So that was difficult and it was confusing for me. Again, if you believe that sexuality is a spectrum, like I had crushes on girls growing up, like that just existed. So in terms of kind of dealing with my own sexuality, I have to kind of process that and figure out what does that mean.
Right.
So because that existed, but my first real gay experience was in like 22. That's the first time I ever hooked up. And then it became really about battling my sexuality around 22 or so. Um,
Did your parents know? Did they and again, you don't have to answer if that's too personal, but, like, did they ever before that period or before that time, like, do you, in hindsight, have the feeling that they suspected and were trying to kind of steer you differently?
they've kind of said two different things on that. So I don't know what's entirely true.
Mhm.
I think our environment was really good about making up our own realities and
Oh,
just
yes.
ignoring, right? And living in
Yes.
some kind of fantasy. So we're all very proficient at that in our little area of the world. So
Yes.
so it's hard to say. I think they suspected they had to in some degree, but again, they didn't think of it in terms of sexual orientation. They thought of it as like some sort of spiritual temptation or something,
Mm.
and
Mm.
it just was viewed so differently. But so when I was 22, my first experience, I remember vividly, like it was the first time that I had allowed myself to even experience same sex sexual experience. I don't know what else to call them without using other words. But so
Right.
I just remember thinking at the time afterwards, like, okay, was that worth me throwing away all my family, all my friends, throwing away God, throwing away church? And the answer was no. There was no way I was in any place, certainly not for sex. And that was the microscope that I guess or the tunnel vision that I had, that it was somehow about sex. And it wasn't until much later in life that I realized, oh, this is really bigger than sex. It's also about relationship, connection. attraction, attachment, like all those other things that go into a relationship. But back then, everyone's just so hyper focused on the sexual act itself that,
Right.
you can't see beyond that.
Well, I think too, I think there's such a link there with purity culture. Y Like, for myself, even, I remember, I think I was 17 and my dad gave me the purity ring.
So,
Yep. Like, it felt like the entire world was so hyper focused on the status of my virginity that, it becomes this huge part of what you think that part of your identity is about, and then it's only kind of after you experience that and you move through that and you're like, "Okay, the sex is the least of it,"
yeah,
right? I mean, that's just the least of it, and I think that purity culture infiltrates in so many ways that it builds sex so up into this kind of juggernaut
yeah,
for people in that religious system that it pushes to the side all of the other tangential things that really inform any conception of sexuality, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah.
So
Well,
this happened and you were weighing this out and thinking, "Okay, if it's just the sex," which is how you were perceiving it at that time,
yeah.
that's not something that's gonna separate the balance of the rest of your identity in that moment, right?
No, it just didn't make sense. And
Mhm.
so from that point on, that was kind of how I moved forward and still would date. Um, and so I guess from 22 to 27 is ultimately when um, I had met my ex-wife. We dated, but there was a period, and I was just talking about this in therapy today, so it's on my mind.
Yay for therapy.
But there was a period, yes. I don't know how anyone survives without therapy, but so there was a period in our engagement after I'd asked her to marry me that I knew I couldn't go forward with the marriage. So I called it off. Like I said, I can't do it. And so there was a 6-month period in there. And finally, I mean, she just asked me point blank, "Is it because of your sexuality?" And I said yes. And so I was able to really be transparent with her at the time, which of course really felt connected. I mean, that
Yeah.
was a pretty big part of me that I was able to share. And it was, but we both were Pentecostal. We both thought, okay, well, that's not what God wants. And so we honestly eloped on that feeling and just got married. So,
Wow. I didn't know that.
yeah. So that was a weird moment, but honestly, I at least feel good about myself that I was able to come clean even before going into
Mhm.
marriage. So that was
Well,
helpful later
that had to
on.
be that had to be scary to some degree though, like to trust
Yeah.
her with that, but then I imagine, like, after trusting her with that, maybe perhaps you felt like, "Okay, if I've got to fit into this mold, at least I can fit into this mold with somebody who knows where I'm coming from and who accepts me," and you kind of felt that reciprocity of trust there,
You do.
perhaps.
You do. I mean, you feel closer. What's so weird though, and I don't talk about this very much because not many can relate, but because of us getting married, it actually erupted because I had confided in one other person. And when I got married, it actually triggered that person to tell a lot of people. So
Mm.
so I was getting phone calls from people that basically saying, "Hey, I heard that you're gay and that you've decided that you're going to live
Wow.
as gay." Like people are calling me after I got married to tell me that that's what they heard.
That they
How
outed
any
you
of
behind
that
your back.
how any of that did not get back to my parents, I will never know. Because honestly, it was the worst kept secret at the time. Like I don't know how that happened.
Right.
Like, but gossip's gossip, so it happened. But I was
Wow.
like, "Well, no, that's not what happened. Yes, I do have." I can't remember what phrase I used back then, to be honest. It wasn't that I was gay or anything like that. It was that, yes, I had experiences, but I'm married now, da 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 da. So something along those lines.
And I just have to say too, having worked extensively in the music side of Pentecostalism, there are
Mhm.
so many musicians
Yeah,
who carry that as a banner of a testimony that,
yeah.
"Oh, I felt this way," or "I had these feelings," or "I had same-sex attraction," or "I lived a gay life, and then I met this person," and they put it in the phrase of, "I was delivered from
Mhm.
that." And that just never sits right, like, so I again, that's not my story, so I don't wanna speak to those feelings, but just as an observer, it's kind of like the people that at least that I have known that were in that situation did not appear to be free, right? they appeared to be performing a life.
Yeah.
And,
Well,
yeah.
there's so many other factors too. There's if you believe in sexuality as a spectrum, people fall on different points of that. There's bisexuality out there that some could actually really be, you know, bisexual. There's so many things really kind of. Uh, I guess there's a lot of noise around that it'd be hard to pinpoint. But as far as any sort of ministry that boasts of any sort of conversion therapy, the biggest one
Mhm.
had a 99% failure rate. Like, that's always been 99% failure. Like, that's tremendous.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I guess kinda going back, I was able to get married, have children, and of course, that was a big important part of my life. However, sexuality was always an issue to the point that I could not stay faithful. And so that triggered deliverance ministries. I went through Celebrate Recovery multiple times, like,
Yep.
if you're
Been
familiar
there.
with these terms. So, but that just was so again, I get hyper focused again. So at that point, going through life, I was hyper focused on my sexuality. Like, how do I deal with this issue that I have? And I looked under every rock that I could. Is it, spiritual? Is it addiction? Is it, because there's abuse in my background too. Like, I could
Mhm.
have to do a whole other story on that. So, there's so many factors and trying to figure out how do I move forward. And it was through more of a deconstruction process religiously that I began to read books like Brian McLaren and Rob Bell or Blue Like
Yeah.
Jazz. I can't remember the name of that author, but there was
Mhm.
just, I went very slow into any sort of deconstruction because that is my nature. I do not like risk. I'm very anxious. Like, if there's a
Mhm.
chance that I'm going to burn in hell, I'm going to take my time and make sure I'm not.
Right. Well,
I
no, but
can't.
that's let's go there for a minute because we were raised, and I know we both were because we sat on the same
Mhm,
pew, we sat many
mhm,
times side by side writing notes
yeah,
during church. So we were raised like with the epitome of the Southern, and just for our listeners for context, we come from the Southern Pentecostal tradition. So add that on there as
Hellfire.
well. Hellfire,
Hellfire.
brimstone.
yes,
And it
Yeah.
was like it was this mindset of, yes, God loves you, but barely, and you better keep your crap together or
God is an angry and a jealous God. How many times did you hear that, right?
Right,
But I was
right.
just explaining, my son asked me today, we were talking about the Antichrist, and
mm,
and he was, "What is that?" And I explained it to him, and I was like, "Dude, this is what we learned every day. The Antichrist is coming, and we're all gonna die." So I don't know about you, Lance, but we've talked about this on other podcasts. I would lay awake at night and read books because we didn't have TV either,
mm,
and I had a record player, but I would
yeah,
lay
Woohoo.
awake at night and read a whole book until 3 in the morning and pass out and be exhausted the next day because I couldn't sleep because I was terrified,
yeah,
Hell.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, of hell. Now, the good part is when I did go to high school and public school and they wanted us to do book reports, I'd already read everything. But I was just terrified growing up, that I was going to hell, like you said. So,
no,
Right,
totally,
no, and from the tradition that we come from, again, just by way of background, you would hear the rhetoric of all sins are equal, like there's no sin, all sin is sin in the eyes of God, but there was definitely a hierarchy of sin.
yeah,
And sexual sin was one of the biggies,
mhm,
And it was like, okay, well, the pastor may tell a lie or cheat on their taxes or do this, that, and the third, but sexual sin is a big one, right?
yeah,
well, I feel like they even sexual sin as far as homosexuality was concerned, that was not just a sin, that was a demon. That you were possessed or something. It's not just a sin of the flesh. It's there's a demon has gotten into you. Is that the way you guys remember it?
I'm interested to hear
what
what
what is
Lance
it?
has to say with
Oppression?
that.
We had
Yes.
another term that was just this side of possession. I think it's
Yeah.
oppression or
Well,
something.
being tormented. You're
Yeah,
being tormented by a
Okay,
homosexual
yeah, yeah.
spirit,
A spirit,
right?
yeah. Tormented by a spirit, right, yeah,
Right, where
exactly.
it's the devil is trying to steal you as a Christian, and they're tempting you and they're tormenting you, and that's kind of like your besetting sin, or, as it were, right? And again, that's your experience, not mine, but that's what I remember kind of contextually. And so I'm just curious, going back to when you started talking about deconstructing. So were you still married at the time that you began
Yes,
deconstructing?
I
What
was.
what led, because I know for me, and we've talked about this on a previous show, what kind of those moments were for me. There were a couple of really pivotal moments where I began, and I didn't at first begin to question God, right? The first thing I began to question was church, and the way that church was being organized, and the way that those principles were being outlaid and being taught to me. And I'm curious for you, if you can pinpoint, like, what were the kind of pivotal moments that led you to even look into deconstructing or to find those books or resources?
The internet. Somehow just having access to other ways of thinking that just didn't exist before until, what, the '90s? I mean,
Yeah.
that was it.
Well, I was gonna ask you, going back to your education, did you go to a college, like a regular college, or was it a Christian college, or you never had
Now,
that experience in college, or
uh, okay, that is another area where I began to get exposed to people, really,
Right.
because I did go, to college, and I also, I've had a job since I was 15. Like,
Yeah, you
I've
have.
I've always worked, and so, even the company I'm at now, I started when I was 18. So, that was my exposure, but again, I always had the sensibility, like, I don't know, I'm a kinda sensitive guy, right? So, I
Mhm.
always had the sensibility that people that I encountered, that people might be gay, it was still, even within the business world that I was in at the time, it was still kinda hush. It was just kind of
Mhm.
whispered about. It wasn't promoted or, celebrated, I guess is really the word, in any way. It was just something that we knew, and my sensibilities was always pretty considerate, I guess. My thinking was, "Oh, well, if it's something that's wrong, that's something that God can take care of, not me." Like, I always kinda had that.
Mhm. Well, and something that T and I have talked about before as well is, and this, I have a pretty heavy abuse background myself, and I don't know if this is a function in part of the world in which we grew up, of kind of having such heavy doom and gloom religious dogma from such a young age. I don't know if it's that, if it's the abuse, if it's just my own psyche, or if everybody's like this. I don't know. Who knows? One of the many choices. But dissociation has been
Uh,
such a part of my life from such
yeah,
an early age that it wasn't until I started going through therapy in my 40s,
yeah,
and I wasn't even I was going through therapy with one of my children, and
yeah,
hearing the therapist talk to them about dissociation, I'm like, "Wait, wait, 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 back the truck up. That's my superpower. Like,
yeah,
that's literally how I survive life is." And I always thought about it like that. Like, I just have this switch in my head where I can truly just kind of I don't
mhm,
wanna say split, like, personality or anything, but, like, I can just compartmentalize so well that those 2 things don't talk to each other, and it's like I in my head know these 2 different things exist, and I'm having trouble articulating what I mean. But, like, and I talked about this a little bit when I talked about my own deconstruction. I was sitting here getting degrees in science and very much kind of in that world of materialism of study from a philosophical perspective, and looking at the world. But I would hold my belief system over here, but it was like at the same time I'm going, okay, I really do not believe the earth is 6,000 years old, and that, the world was created in but that I don't have to rationalize that because that's in my belief system, and I can put that over here in this compartment
yeah.
and not touch that, and then over here have the part of me that is rational, logical, and scientific. And I'm curious for you, if you have found that dissociation has played a part of your life like that, and, being able to kind of bifurcate that identity.
And I do understand what you're saying, but it is something that I'm still exploring, to be honest, in the sense of where did that superpower that you described come from? Because I was very immersed, just like you were, maybe T, not so much, in terms of experiencing Pentecost, tongues, all the things that went with that. Like, I was you know,
We were in it.
and I was in the deep end all the time with that because I could respond to the emotionality of all of it and all the energy and all of those things. Like, I mean, that I was right there.
No,
And
we
I do
went to the
feel like,
camp meetings, right?
right.
And people were getting slain in the spirit and passed out and being drunk in the spirit, and, like,
Mhm.
and we experienced that as teenagers,
Yeah.
and on. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry to
I
interrupt.
mean, it started for me when I was 6. Like,
Right, right,
I, I,
right.
I was crying in the altar trying to speak in tongues. And that was my focus for a very early part of my life because I knew if I didn't speak in tongues, I was going to hell. Like that was, and that T goes back to your conversation about PTSD. I've learned, at least for me, I call it complex PTSD because it wasn't
Yes,
like a moment in time. It was just this constant saturation of trauma, really,
yes.
that I experienced. So, and then ultimately, I did speak in tongues, and then what a relief, right?
Well, I remember, the going dovetailing on what you said, I would go when my parents were out of town and go in their closet and smell their clothes,
Mhm.
'cause they all smelled like perfume or cologne or whatever, and just be terrified that the rapture was gonna come, and I hadn't spoken in tongues, and I had
Mhm.
this dream of, like, I'm like, "My mom and dad are gonna hold on to me, they're gonna take me, if I can't go." Um, that's one of the unfortunately for me, one of the few memories I have of my childhood because a lot of the other stuff I just don't remember. I don't remember a lot of stuff growing up. I do
Yeah.
remember going to your church and you had a lot more good-looking girls there than we did at ours.
And boys, and boys. Let's not forget those boys. There was a couple of cuties there.
No
But
comment.
or to go back to speaking in tongues, I find that interesting, not surprising, given that Acts 2:38 was such a foundation. I can still quote it to this day,
Yeah, sure.
and it was such a foundational principle, and that's really what we were taught was the distinction of our branch of Christianity, right? Was that I mean, I remember being overtly taught that other Protestant religions, they didn't have the real deal because they were basically a paper tiger. They were powerless. They had a form of the gospel, but not the power of the gospel that came
Right.
from speaking in tongues and being baptized in Jesus' name and then the fruits of the Spirit. And for me, I remember having that experience. I think I was like 6 or 7, fairly young, which now as an adult makes my heart sad a little bit for little me, which that's a whole by the way, if I think what is her name? There's a singer, I think her name is Maddie something. She used to be a worship leader and she's now come out as gay, and she has a song about looking back at her childhood self that
Oh,
just breaks my heart. I'll send it to you if I find it.
yeah.
Uh, but in that time, for me, the experience was I would be in the church and I would be so consumed by the emotionalism of it, which if you
Mhm.
haven't experienced it, it's really hard to explain. I think probably the closest thing, if anybody out there has not experienced this, that T and I have talked about before, is like it's kind of like when you go to a concert and everybody's like with their hands up in the air and they're all singing, and it's like this moment and you feel your heart like with that rush of emotions and almost tears in your eyes. Multiply that, exponentially, and then add in the fact that church musicians are very skilled and
Yeah.
adept at using music as such an influential part of emotional, not to be harsh, but emotional manipulation, you know? And me
Mhm.
being a musical person, I remember
Mhm.
having those moments of just being so caught up. And then the minute it was over, the minute the spell broke, so to speak, me sitting there and going, did I just make that up? Did I just make myself do that? Right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, I just spoke in tongues, but am I and then for me, the fear was feeling like I'm blaspheming
Yeah.
because maybe it wasn't as authentic as it should have been, and I'm doctoring the experience, and
Mhm.
God knows, and I'm gonna get in trouble for that.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? So
Fear
it's
upon
like
fear. Just yeah,
it's
absolutely.
well, and if you take that apart and you unpack it, kind of what we're all talking about in different ways is it's this like woven in from the womb need to question, is this real or is it Memorex, right? Like, is this my reality or is this just am I on the outside trying to perceive this as my reality because I've been told
Yeah.
that's what it's supposed to be? And I think fundamentally, when you have that, and then when you couple in any type of other abuse besides the religious trauma, where you're kind of questioning what you're experiencing through the lens of reality, it really warps your ability to trust yourself,
That's
right?
great.
And when you can't trust yourself, then you can't distinguish, is this my true feeling or am I being tempted? Right?
Yeah.
Like, is this, for me, it goes down to, is this red flag my intuition? Is this God speaking to me? Or is this my own fears and the devil's trying to lead me away from something? Right. And so that whole milieu of just self questioning your own perceptions and what
Yeah.
reality is, I can't imagine then coupling that, into your experience. And so going back to your experience, because I want to finish your story, you're
It's a
in that
long one. I'm
stage.
old.
No, so are we all. It's a privilege. So you're there, you're beginning the deconstructing process. You've had a couple of experiences, you're now married. And were your children already here when you began kind of deconstructing, or did that?
Yes, because
Okay.
like I said, Pentecostal, like United UPC, very involved. I also managed like a FW church choir for UP2 back in the day,
Wow.
like during this period, and so I grew up around a lot of talented singers. Obviously, being
Mhm.
the two of you, everyone is so talented. I didn't really start singing until I kind of started to migrate into more UPC and getting involved in choir. And that was fun. I loved it. Like that,
Right.
in terms of community and belonging, getting to know other people, and kind of at the height of our experience for that was being called by Kirk Franklin to participate in his Rebirth recording, and
Wow.
so that was a lot of fun. That was really a lot of fun. So that was kind of balled up in my experience in Pentecost really at the time as well. But I guess what even made me mention about speaking in tongues is because you were talking about disassociation. And that is something that I guess I'm still trying to understand myself because I feel like we were trained to disassociate. Like that was the goal of church was to disassociate in a way. And that's why we're so good at it. I think like we can
That's a
do that.
good point. That's such a good
Like
point. No, we were really trained, like, be in the world, not of the
mhm,
world. Be, you shouldn't set your mind on higher things, and you should always be constantly. That's a good point. We were trained in dissociation.
yeah, it was the goal. And
Wow.
I historically have always kind of thought, well, I think I missed that experience because it was cathartic. Like
Eh.
I always put the value on cathartic experiences and how that kind of brought some sense of peace or whatever. But I'm starting to re-question that. And
Mhm.
think of it in terms of disassociation and thinking, okay, well, that really hasn't helped me in other ways, I think. And I don't think I was exposed to as much science maybe as you have been in your education process. Because I remember thinking, honestly, watching The Cosmos by Neil deGrasse Tyson was the first time that I started really being exposed by any sort of science, or maybe there's maybe things that we've described as spiritual, and we tend to over spiritualize everything in our upbringing. Anything that we
Mhm.
don't understand is automatically over spiritualized, but even the science was always spiritualized. And so I began to think in terms of, okay, well, maybe there's more cosmic things happening in the universe than I realize, and people have used spiritual words to describe it. And so I began to question that. And so I guess all of these things, and just as you have kids, I wanted them to go to public school. I didn't want them to in private school because of my experience.
Yeah.
So it was just kind of a slow burn that I began to be exposed to other ideas and other science, and began to have a bit more freedom to be more critical thinking. And then that just evolved. I remember the first thing, like, I guess the first thing that I remember letting go was belief in the devil. Like, at some point, that's like one of the first things is like,
Yes.
I don't think I believe in a personified devil. I just don't believe that. And I remember mentioning that to my ex wife, and her automatic response was, what? You don't believe in the Bible? Like,
Yeah.
that was
Right.
her
Right. Right.
first response,
Right.
right? Because we were Pentecost, and so that one statement is one of the early memories that I have of deconstructing something significant, I
Right.
guess.
No, that's such a good point, though, because, and it's interesting you say that. I remember for me, there was a podcast. Gosh, what was The Liturgist? I don't know if you ever
Mhm.
listened to The Liturgist.
Oh
And
yeah, many times.
yeah, and I think one time perhaps they were discussing Rob Bell's book, one of Rob Bell's books. I can't
Hmm.
remember, but it was about hell.
Yeah.
and the devil. And I remember for the first time, like, isolating that concept instead of kind of being part of, the pantheon of ideas, just really pulling that one thought and thinking about a devil. And
Yeah.
I told T before, there were 3 questions that kind of really prompted me, and that centered around that idea of why a devil, right? Because if God is all knowing, then God knew there would be
Mhm.
a temptation. And if God is all loving, then how could God then allow, XYZ to happen? And it just really, really pulled a thread in the sweater for me.
Yeah.
And that was kind of my first step too, was okay, I still believe, but especially having been a parent, I can't imagine punishing my child for eternity for a temporal
Right.
transgression, right?
Yeah.
And so that's very interesting that that was your kind of your first thread in the sweater as well. And so,
Yeah.
so go on from there. What happened next?
Well, parenthood does change your perspective too, I believe, because
Healthy
if
parenting.
if I begin to think like, would I condemn my child to some sort of eternal pain, judgment, torture, the idea of hell? And I know in my heart I would never do that. I know I could not do that. And so in some sense, I'm saying I'm more loving than God is. Like it's
Exactly. Yeah.
that's
Right.
that's such a weird thing.
Right.
um. Anyhow, so I guess the more I read, somewhere along the way, I believed it's okay for other people to be gay, but I
Mhm.
was still, like I said, going through Celebrate Recovery and trying to figure out my own mind on the topic. And then finally, in January of 2016, I remember driving to work, listening to Rob Bell podcast, and finally, I allowed myself. This is the disassociation part. Like I allowed myself to literally think, without casting it away in my mind. What if I'm just gay? What if it's just that? And before then, I could never really allow my mind to even
Right.
consider that. I just would dismiss it. No, no, I have family, I have kids, I have God, I just can't, and dismiss it, dismiss it, dismiss it. But that day, for some reason, I let it in. And then when I did, that was the dam that came breaking down, and there was no way to plug that back up. I just cried and cried and cried and cried just from that one thought because I just suddenly in that moment I felt like it really explained a lot of struggles that I've had. And so that was probably January, and it was April before I could tell my ex-wife at the time. So, but then, and then I didn't tell other people and probably till July that year. Um, we tried to figure out what we were going to do, but ultimately divorced. And
Can I
in
ask you a personal
2016,
question on that?
yeah,
And
yeah,
again, you don't have to answer if it's too personal. I was just curious, like, initially, was her approach like, no, you're not, this is an act of the enemy. This is the devil trying to break us up and break up our family. And we can get through this through spiritual tactics? Or was she kind of like, okay, I hear you and I understand. And I don't
no,
like this for us, but this is how it is.
she had a bit more practicality about her. I
Okay.
don't remember. I don't remember the over spiritualization.
That's
But
good.
yeah, but I do know what you're talking about. I would have expected that too of anyone that grew up Pentecostal.
Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah,
No, I asked because again, when I was leaving my relationship, those were some of the things that were hurled at me as you are being deceived. This is the devil. The devil is trying to destroy, kill, steal, and destroy, and split up your home and your marriage.
yeah,
You need to go. And for those who don't know, when we're referencing Celebrate Recovery, that is the Christian equivalent of like 12-step. It is a 12-step program. And although
mhm,
most of them are based in faith, this one is based overtly kind of Protestant Christianity ideas and practices and is heavily practiced now through, especially through the megachurch explosion and kind of
yeah.
charismatic evangelicism in that world. So you told your wife, and how did that feel for you?
Well, that was rough.
Yeah, I bet.
That was rough, but what I do remember is there was peace that went along with it at night. It's like it's out in the open, you know. It's something that we can actually deal with instead of trying to always deal with it internally. At least
Mhm.
now we could actually respond to it externally and try to figure out life at that point. So there is a certain amount of relief that goes with that. But but then there's parents. And
So
it's
did
so
they know at this point?
they didn't know. We wouldn't tell anyone until we could tell the kids.
Okay.
That was our rule. We didn't tell the kids till July, and then once we told the kids, then we could tell other people. So we held on to it for a while, and then my parents. Okay, so I wrote a letter because I knew it wasn't going to be much of a conversation, and I just had a printout of it, and I had the conversation with my dad face to face, but it was short, and I just gave him the letter to take with him because that was pretty much all we could do. And then my mother had to find out secondhand from that. And then that just was slowly the process, you know, it wasn't just, I'm coming out, I'm gay, but it's also we're getting divorced, and, like, it was kind of the whole package of everything all at once. I remember having coffee with my dad after that to kinda still process a little bit, and one of the first questions he asked me was, "Do you still speak in tongues?" That was like his first
Wow.
that was, like, one of his
Wow,
first
no, there's
Wow.
so much there though, because like the implications,
Mhm.
right? The
That's the litmus
implications of that.
test. That was
Yes.
always.
Because is God still, are you still open to that? Are you still in touch with this? Are you still able to kind of make
Mhm.
that connection spiritually? Wow, that's very interesting. And it's such a symbol of salvation,
Yeah,
you know.
it is.
Interesting.
So I at least was able to confirm yes at the
Mhm.
time. So I think that helped. Um, but from that point on, I mean, honestly, I've had to grieve so many things. Like, I'm still dealing with the grief of all of it, the grief of ideas, the grief of dreams, the grief of friends that I had, because I lost a lot of friends, during that time. I've lost family connections. There's a lot of loss that goes along with coming out. You gain yourself, but you lose a lot of other people.
Right.
Wow. Which is interesting. And when you said that, it brought to mind the scripture, what profits a man if they gain the whole
Mhm.
world and lose their soul? And the irony that you really found your soul in coming to the truth of expressing who you are and how you are in the world. You know, that's very
Yep.
interesting.
Were you, after you came out to your wife and your parents, were you still attending church with the same church and everything? And
Uh,
how was that
no,
experience, if
because
so?
okay, I did have a few progressive friends at the time. So while I had lost a lot of friends, there were some folks in my life that were very supportive. I don't think I could have made it without them, to be honest. Like, that was a huge, huge win. And it was
You know who
kind of
your
more
real
for,
friends are then when you
Yeah.
yeah,
if
Yeah, you do.
you do. So at that point, I'm no longer in Pentecostal churches. I'm more evangelical.
Okay.
At that point, and there was even an opportunity for me to go. And actually, my friends that I'm even referring to have since split off and created their own church that's LGBT affirming, and all
Nice.
that's kind of just triggered through all of this. So they just kind of grew along during my whole coming out experience and created safe spaces for me. And because spirituality was important to me, I was doing like a small group to reconcile spirituality and sexuality. And so that actually even kind of grew and helped me make more connections to other folks.
well, your
So,
coming out is actually like I was thinking it's been like a small pebble thrown in a pond, it's made big ripples going out,
yeah,
and actually you coming out has probably brought more LGBTQ people into the church, ironically enough.
yeah,
Well, and I mean,
possibly.
just to share with you, I have a someone in my life who identifies as gay, and I remember when they came to me with that, reaching out to you and being like, how do I support them? What I need to know from you, like, what do they need from me right now? And you were such a resource and helping me try to become an ally at that time, which I'm very grateful for. But I'm curious, at this time when you were coming out and you were coming to acceptance of yourself, and I hear you so deeply on the grief. Again, different stories, but
Uh-huh.
like for me, losing the music, there, it's just. And if you've ever been to a Pentecostal church, the music is one of the best parts. And for me as a musician and having been so ingrained in that world since before I was born, like literally growing in my mother's womb while she was playing the organ and singing 3 times a week, I always say music is my first language. And so it felt very much like leaving my home country, you know? And there's a shorthand of language that you use among church folks, and somebody's like, God is good, and you know what to say all the time,
All the
right?
time. Yep.
And there's such a belonging and a culture within itself that when you walk away from that, it's almost a feeling of nobody is ever going to fully understand the fullness of who I am from this stage forward, because they're not going to understand that part of me where I came from. And I
Yeah.
can't go back to where I came from with the people that knew me then, because they don't understand the person I am now. And it's really a point of isolation. And I'm
Mhm.
curious for you, when you were in that stage of the process where, like, you've told your wife, you've told your kids, you've told your parents, and you're kind of navigating the waters of who are my friends now, and where is my place, that part of yourself and God. Like, did you feel like, okay, I can be who I am and still keep my relationship or my conception of God in relation to me in that sense? Do you know what I'm saying? Or did
Yeah,
you feel like
no.
if I embrace this part of
Uh-huh.
myself, I'm going to have to let that go?
No, I was not letting it go.
Okay.
Definitely not. However, I had the opportunity because of, like I said, my friends that were more progressive were actually at that time starting a satellite campus. And so I went with them, but we were still um, following the rules of the mothership, so to speak.
Got
Meaning,
you.
because I had come out, I was no longer allowed to sing. Right? I was no longer allowed to be on stage. There was specific I was not allowed to teach Sunday school any longer, but I could be a greeter. So I was allowed to greet people and hold the door. So that's what I did because I wasn't gonna leave. Um, which at the time felt good. I don't know why, but in retrospect, it's like, well, that's shitty.
Right.
Right,
Right.
we'll take your money and we'll let you do all the grunt work,
Exactly.
but stay out of the mic.
You can be in the room, but you can't sit at the table.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I
Uh,
hear you. I hear you with that.
and honestly, in some ways, I do think that was a catalyst for my supportive group of friends to really break off, following all that, so that they could be fully LGBT affirming and be their authentic selves, not have this conflict of values that they were having to adhere to because they were part of this larger organization. So that was freedom for them, and I'm very grateful for them, sacrificing their own connections and their own family and their own loss that they've experienced. But I held on and did what I could just so that I could be there, um, and still have the connection of belonging, but also my spirituality. But even now, when I look back, I do believe that the weight is on community and connections. What we received that from church, the way that we were brought up, like that's, and it was always so intimate, maybe to a level of enmeshment. And that's another concept that I have to
Yes.
figure out,
Yes.
because we were very boundaryless through everything growing up. And now here I am trying to, in my 50s, try to learn how to set healthy boundaries. That's rough.
No, I have to, you'll appreciate this. I did this, there's this little trend right now on social media where you say phrases that you were told as a child, but you let your own child finish them. And like, for example, one of them is children should be seen and,
Not
and we all know what we would say, not heard, right? So I was playing that game with my youngest today. She's 8. And the last one was respect your, and you know what we would say to that, respect your
Elders.
elders, right?
elders.
And so I said, okay, what would you say if mommy said respect your, and she said boundaries? And I'm like, yes,
Wow.
winning.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're getting there. We're all getting there. But I
We
hear
are.
you. The boundaries journey is when you're not taught that you are an entity of your own, when you're not ever given any practice at making decisions, when no is a word you're not allowed to say, and when you are in a place where even if you do have a no, it can then be manipulated from a spiritual perspective of, well, what would, that's not
Right.
the right thing, or that's not the this thing. You truly have no concept of boundaries. And I remember even in my 30s, like hearing about boundaries, and I'm like, I could not conceive of how to make that applicable in my daily life at all.
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, boundaries are rules of what I will allow other people to do. Now I'm finally understanding, no, has nothing to do with other people. Boundaries
Yeah.
mean this is where I set my guidelines. You can do whatever you choose to do, and that's fine. But I choose not to engage with that behavior, right?
Right.
And that's a whole journey. So kudos to you
Yeah.
for practicing that. But yeah, we were not raised with any conception of
No.
boundaries or even personal identity.
No. No, all foreign, but
Yeah,
we're learning. We're
we're
learning.
getting there.
Yeah, and so flash forward to 2020, remarried. So my husband and I are coming up on 5 years this year.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
He's a handsome fella too. You got a good one.
He is. He's highly intelligent, so smart it blows my mind sometimes. So he's just been a huge support to me. A lot of how I grew up is very foreign to him, but he's always been very compassionate and patient. Really, there's a lot of patience there. So I'm very fortunate to have him in my life.
Was he raised in the church?
He was. So that's the other thing. I mean, he's black, so I'm in an interracial relationship. There's a lot of differences between black Christians and white Christians. There just
Mhm.
is. So black folks know what it is to be oppressed and discriminated. So there's a lot more understanding on that side than what we have in the predominantly white churches. So
That's interesting because I think white Christianity, and especially right now, my God, it's having such a media moment of demonstrating the persecution complex. And let me
yeah,
just say for all those listening, white Christians in America are not persecuted. Okay. They've never been persecuted. And the persecution complex is a scheme. It's a falsehood. And so it's really interesting how much that's being played upon, but then to hear that, coming from the perspective of Black Christianity, where there is a true history of oppression, that they were actually far more accepting and open minded.
totally. Yes. I mean, and obviously there's pockets, throughout,
Right.
but I think it's a safe generalization that there's a lot more understanding there. So yeah, that's been interesting for me to watch and
Right.
be jealous of in some ways. Like,
Yeah.
How does your family have they met your husband? How do they feel
oh
about
yeah.
that? Your mom and dad, and are
They
they okay with that, or do you guys still get along and talk?
um,
Because to be upfront with you, I haven't talked to my parents in a few years. So
yeah,
there was a conversation I had with my dad that was just an ender, and I'm like, I can't. I had to set my boundaries, and unfortunately, I'm either all in or all out.
that's not a bad way to be.
No,
In some ways, I'm envious of that.
me too.
Honestly, I feel like in some ways you probably saved yourself a lot of heartache. But I did try to keep the door open for as long as I could. There were some lines that were crossed, and so at this point, we're cordial. For probably the last 2.5 years, we are cordial. The kids still have games and performances and band and all kinds of things, and so we're often together there. And I mean, we're always going to be polite and respectful. I have no problem. Those are values that are important to me and that I want the kids to understand. And they know that there's issues around me being gay that really haven't allowed us to have a close relationship. And I always remind the kids, I said, but that doesn't matter. We're always going to be respectful and just say hello and polite and show everyone, basic dignity always. And so,
I
That's
tell you, man,
interesting too
just
because you're an only child,
yeah,
and I remember talking about jealousy, not being jealous that you're an only child. Sorry, D. But no,
liar.
I know, right? That's where I thought she was going.
I remember observing, because my own familial relationships were a whole nother bag of tricks. But I remember observing you in your family and thinking, wow, like, wow. And this is going to sound harsh, and I don't mean it harsh, but I was like, wow, that's what it's like to be loved so
Yeah,
overtly and be doted on. And I mean, because I just remember you were the apple of your parents' eye. And I remember you and your mom being so close that you were like friends,
yeah, and
or at
I
least.
was gonna say I was surprised that you talked to your dad first. I would have assumed
Mhm.
just the little bit I knew you when we were young that you would have talked to your mom first because you guys seem so close.
I can imagine why. I can. My dad's just more laid back.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
about why.
Your dad's
yeah.
really, like, even keeled. He's
He,
super
He
even keeled.
you wouldn't want to meet him in a dark alley, but
Yeah.
oh,
he's a big dude,
honestly,
is what I mean. But
he
yeah,
is.
he
He
seems
is.
really chill.
He's pretty laid back. I mean, until he explodes, that does happen. Like,
Yeah.
um, but pretty rare. And he's so more consistent. Let me put it that way. My mom was always more volatile, so I was always
Got you.
afraid of reactions. I just could not predict. My dad's a bit more predictable, so that felt
Yeah,
safer.
that makes
Um,
sense.
yeah. Um, so
But when
I miss my parents.
you know what I miss? I miss my parents, but I miss the idea that I had in my head that when I had kids, they would be these great grandparents. Um, and I just can't trust my kids to go with my parents and the indoctrination that would follow. And that makes me sad. I wanted, the leave it to beaver, sort of thing, or just a grandma that would come and take my kids and take them to do stuff, take them to Legoland or whatever. But
I want anybody to
one
take my
thing that
kids. Just kidding.
anybody, yeah, right.
Just
One
kidding.
thing, when my oldest son was born, or when my wife was pregnant with my oldest son, my wife and I were married legally, but we hadn't had a church wedding. Um, and we
Mhm.
hadn't told my parents that we were married because yeah, didn't want to go mess with all that. But when I told them that we were going to have our son, they told me that he was going to go to hell because we had him out of wedlock. So no matter what happened, our son was going to hell. So that was just kind of my experience and my first experience of this great moment. I'm having a kid. I'm excited. I'm scared to death. I'm 25 years old. I'm tripping out. I have no idea what I'm going to do with my life. That was the response I got. And every kind of big moment in my life, my wedding, everything like that, the responses were not what I would have wanted and not what I expected and not what my parents weren't the people I thought they were. And it just, that's what breaks my heart, I think, even more than my relationship with them, because that was never that great.
Well, but it goes back to that grieving, and I've had a lot of things to grieve in my life. Even with the passing of my first husband and the dissolution of our marriage. I remember one time in therapy, having a hard time articulating those feelings. And the therapist kind of gave me the language by saying, "You're grieving the loss of the dream that you held."
Yeah,
You know, and there's such validity to that. And I think that, oftentimes one of the beautiful things about growing up and becoming a parent and then our parents becoming grandparents is that, it's the old trope of, oh, why weren't you like this with me? You're a much better grandpa than you were a dad or whatever. And when there's something in the equation, and this is kind of how I look at it, right? And I'm interested to hear your perspectives. From my observation, when there's something in a relationship equation that becomes the other thing, whether that's an addiction, whether that's religious beliefs, whether that's political beliefs, when there's something else there, it kind of becomes like the third party in the relationship. And so then the relationship is not, it's like trying to have a relationship with somebody who's got a mistress. Do you know what I mean? Like that thing always comes first. It always interjects in between. It always divides the authenticity of the connection. And in my family, that's been substance abuse and also religion. And it's very much been this kind of thing of like, if it wasn't for religion, yes, we'd still have, boomer parents that don't understand boundaries and, this, that, and the third. But there would be less of that, like, you're over there, I'm over here. Does that make sense to you, or do you perceive it in that way?
I
I
don't know.
totally do.
I
Does
don't
that make
know.
sense? Interesting thought. So then you go from there and you're working out your piece with your parents. And I'm curious, if you don't mind me asking, where has this journey taken you in your faith at present?
Okay. Honestly, so one thing, like, honestly, it affected me just to hear T talk about what was said to him. That just is horrible to me.
Yeah.
And I'm so sorry that that happened. That's just mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
That, another level. So I hope you feel validated in that, and I just and totally understand you have to take whatever survival measures you have for yourself, for your family, for your kids. I get that. So,
I appreciate that.
um, yeah, um, my faith, honestly, but post COVID, we haven't attempted to try to find any sort of church community since COVID. So, in the process of that, we've looked elsewhere for community. Most recently, in the last year, I joined a community choir that practices at University of Texas Dallas, and so that's kind of my attempt to re-engage singing again, which by the way has scientific merit, by the way, in terms of the vagus nerve and depression and all those
Mhm.
things. Like there's
Yep.
so many things there that I felt like I was missing. I think I have spent more time and focus less on the spirituality of myself and focus more on mental health.
Mm.
I just don't have the energy to I haven't necessarily discarded some of the ways of wisdom that I think exists in Christianity, but I went through a period of reverse engineering everything,
Mhm.
meaning I know it's good to love people and I need to kind of reverse and come up with another way of articulating scripture in a way that supports what I know to be right. So instead of and at some point I kind of got tired of reverse engineering. And a buddy of mine said it kind of the best, like he just didn't care. He's like, I do not care that your book tells you to be shitty to people. I do not care. Your book is stupid. If that's really your basis, then your book is stupid.
No, that's so true, and, like, one of the things that I say frequently on here is a huge eye opener for me was meeting the best Christians I'd ever met, and they were people who did not
Yeah,
call themselves Christians and said the same thing. There may be good stuff in there, but,
yeah.
there's stuff in there that is encouraging you to be a very bad person, and that was mind blowing. So, yeah, I hear you on that.
So I have looked for other avenues, especially where my children are concerned, to be more inclusive of all religions and what we all have in common, and to call them the books of wisdom. Like this is just wisdom that's been passed down, um, and share concepts of Buddhism and concepts of Christianity and concepts of Islam and like just anything that I can to say, here are some common themes. And we know that these are good principles because we want to be loving people. We want to be caring people. We want to be respectful people. We want and really approach it. And honestly, this has been a big influence on my husband because I grew up very rules based
Right.
and
Yeah,
had no concept of principles or
right.
values. And so
Interesting.
to
Yeah.
be able to kind of flip that around and really focus the last 5 years on what are our values for our home going to be with the kids, with my kids, his stepkids. What are we going to build? What are the important values that we want to focus on? And yes, I can take all those concepts and reverse engineer it and come up with scriptures and lessons and things to support that. I don't necessarily feel the need to do that anymore. Like, I just don't feel like I
Huge.
have to do that.
When
Um,
I was in college, I took an English class, and the professor taught the Bible as literature, not as any kind of holy scripture or anything like that. And it was one of the best. I guess that's really what started my quote unquote deconstruction.
yeah,
Was that class when he just taught it as literature? It made so much more sense to me. You
mhm,
know, the not looking at it as religion and looking at it just as Beowulf.
Right.
yeah,
And when you look at it like that, and you don't have that anvil hanging over your head of blasphemy for questioning things or looking
right.
at it in that way, it's a lot easier to have a different perspective of it, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Oh,
Well,
that's
you can actually
such a
take
good
some of the
point.
good from it when you see it that way
Yeah,
and
exactly.
realize that you don't have to take the bad from it.
But
Yeah.
I want to go back really, really quickly, and I know we're running long, but I wanted to touch on something you said because I feel like
Mhm,
it's really powerful. The difference between rules versus values.
mhm,
That is so huge, right? And it's like, if you kind of put a practicality on it, it's like the difference between I want my children to have the tools to be
mhm,
able to make positive, healthy, considerate, wise decisions. I would much rather them have to kind of grapple with that and find that toolkit than to just know. Mom said, don't go to this store after 9 o'clock. Mom said, don't drink this
Right.
thing, right? Because mom's not always going to be there. And my
Mhm.
concept of parenting is my job as a parent is to work myself out of a job, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yeah,
when my kids, my older two went off to college and I had family, ask me, oh, are you sad? Do you feel emptiness? I'm like, no, I raised them to have a life. This is the point, right? Is to raise them
yeah,
to be able to have those skills and tools and do things. But the way that we were raised was not that way. And this for me was such a point of confusion as a child. And the way you articulated it just really flipped a switch in my head. I was looking for kind of the ground rules of values,
yeah,
and we weren't given that. What we were given was really a rule with a referential value attached, right?
yeah,
But it wasn't a broad enough stroke because it's like, well, why is this okay in this situation, but not in this situation? Like, why is it not okay to go bowling, but it's okay to go roller skating, right?
yeah.
What's the underlying value attachment there that's validating this rule? And that's so interesting to hear kind of how you flipped that on its head and said, no, we're not going to kind of go from the top down. We're going to go from the bottom up and build a foundation where we
Right.
first identify our core values, and then the rules, as it were, kind of flow out of those value systems in a way that is logical and makes
Mhm.
sense and is true. And you don't have to then sit there and literally sweat the small stuff of, am I going to hell if I
Yeah,
wear these two different colored socks? Right?
right.
Because it's not about the rule. It's about, ironically, Christian speak, you could say it's not about the rules, it's about the relationship. Hang on
Mhm.
1 second. Sorry, you're gonna have to edit that out.
No,
However, I've not seen that to really play out. That tends to be kind of the band-aid of Christian speak, but it still winds up being about the rules.
mhm. Yeah,
So that's really interesting to hear your
It's
perspective
not
of
only
that.
the rules, it's the, if you don't follow the rules, you're gonna go to hell, and how many people, their values are based on fear, and fear of going to hell,
Right.
and not really based on them wanting to be a good person or
Well, no, but it's like the analogy of, I'm not I don't withhold uphold the vows of my marriage because I'm afraid the marriage police are going to come clock me, you
right.
know, if I wink at a cute guy running by or whatever. I uphold my marital values because I love my partner. I
Mhm.
respect them. I want to behave in a way that's honorable of the love and the commitment that we share. And that's what governs my behavior. I totally agree with where you're coming from. And to that point, I have one more question for you. Where do you stand now with the concept of hell, and how were you able to make peace with that? Because I think that's where a lot of us really, really do struggle. And I think that's a place where our intellect tries to override like our inner child fears. But when those are so heavily programmed in throughout, your entire childhood and formative years and
Yeah.
even adulthood, what peace have you found with hell? If that makes sense.
It took a long time. I mean, I had to read the books that exposed me to other ways of thinking, the new kind of Christian, new kind of Christianity, like all those things, to the point that I have let all of those concepts go in the traditional sense. Like, I don't believe in terms of the heavily, what, Greek, Roman influence of a Zeus like god that sits on high with thunderbolts and
Right.
um, a concept of Hades and punishment and, a demon that's really just trying to get your soul the exposure to, like I said, the cosmos and realizing, or I don't know, just looking at the trend, right, of how people were afraid to admit that the Earth revolved around the sun, or just, and I just feel like we have those same level of ignorance now, just in a different way. So I've kind of abandoned those traditional ways of thinking about hell, God, and I just kind of believe a bit more in the universe. And
Yeah.
I tend to use more cosmic language now, but I do believe in connection. I believe there's ways for us to have connection. I can't explain it.
Right.
Um, I would have used spirituality as a term that connects us. So I don't know. I'm probably still in the throes of trying to figure out what the right semantics are to explain what I believe. But I have shifted more to a desire. to learn more about science and shy away from the fear of the unknown and the temptation to over spiritualize things I don't understand.
Wow,
So,
that's a big one. That's a big one, and we will have another show where we talk about the impact of over spiritualization and the development of magical thinking OCD, which is a whole nother train of thought. But no, I think that's wise, and that kind of reminds me of where I am in my own journey. When people say, well, where are you with this? And I'm like, here's where I am with that. I leave space for the unknown,
yeah.
but I don't build my life on guesses.
Mhm.
you know but I leave space for the awe. I leave space for the mystery, the wonder. We don't know what we don't know, but what I do know is that if there is something existentially magical and wonderful, and the other threads that weave us all together, that is the connecting fiber that we kind of can't explain. I don't think that something that grand and marvelous and magnificent is really caught up in the minutia of the ways that we have developed to manipulate that to control each other.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and the other thing about deconstruction is at some point you have to begin constructing again. And for
yeah.
us, it has been about really trying to start with the values first and moving up from there because when you do that, you can also incorporate new information. Like if more science comes out and they can explain more about homosexuality and how the brain works, and I mean, there's all kinds of room for new information. But if we've started with fundamental values of respect and love and caring, I mean, you have room for all those things. It doesn't work the other way. So
Wow.
Right. That
That's
yeah,
so
that
impactful.
that makes a lot of sense on a lot of levels.
No, that's such a great point, though, and one that I think that, I honestly had not conceived of it in that way until you just said that. But at a certain point of deconstruction, yeah, you have to. It's kind of like, if you're remodeling a house, right? You can take out walls, take out flooring, do all the things. You can even go down to the foundation. But
yeah,
essentially, at some point, you look around and you say, okay, what things that I've taken apart here are things that are worthy and good and will stand the test of time and reflect who I am, that I want to reincorporate back into my life.
yeah,
And then leaving space for that unknown, leaving space for the things that you haven't yet brought into your life, and looking at that with fresh eyes. And I think that's a beautiful thing about this journey, although it's been painful for so many of us, is having the opportunity to really unpack that. And then as adults, looking back at our life and saying, how am I going to choose to recreate a world for myself? And I think that what you're doing and come from a place of those values that you're truly rooted in, not only is it beautiful, but if there is something out there that's higher and wiser and greater than us, I think that's honestly the most honoring thing that you can do. So, well done, you.
well, thank you. I had a lot of help.
Don't we all? Don't we all? And honestly, I'd love to have you back. I know we've probably gone over your time, and thank you for sharing your time with us. But I'd really love to have you back and, maybe join in our discussion on politics and families and kind of what that looks like. And I know each of us have a parent that has kind of gone to certain extremes with that and voicing that in the other direction. So maybe that's a conversation we can pick up again uh, a second time. But it's been great to hear your story and to reconnect with you. And I really appreciate your vulnerability and sharing with us. And just as we wrap up, I'd ask you, is there anything, not to sound cheesy, but, especially with it being Pride and in the environment where we're living at present, and all the vitriol that's kind of out there, what would you say to someone who is maybe perhaps questioning their identity or questioning their sexuality, or is wondering how to have that conversation with parents, especially, or family, or a spouse or a partner who's really involved in the religious world that we come from? words would you say to that person right now?
There's nothing wrong with waiting until you feel absolutely safe sharing and being that vulnerable. And really look for those people, those spaces that you do feel safe, and really engage in those areas. Safety first, your own physical safety, mental safety, like all those things.
Financial safety? Yeah.
Financial safety, absolutely. So there's nothing wrong with that. But fortunately, and at this time, I think there are plenty of spaces like, with the internet, defined areas. There's all kinds of resources. PFLAG was one of mine. That was just a huge benefit to me. So look for those areas to be authentic and then go from there. And, there's no rush. There's no rush. So that's really, I guess, the top of mind thing that I would say. Yeah.
It's like, there's a great quote by Emily Dickinson, and I'm probably gonna butcher it, but it says something to the effect of I think it's by Emily Dickinson. Maybe I'm wrong. Whoever it's by, it's a great quote. And essentially it says, "It's never too late to become who you might have been."
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Lance, I want to recommend a book to you.
Okay.
I a few years ago was going through some issues, and I met this Episcopal priest who was
Mhm.
not a priest anymore. He had left the religion, but he gave me a book, and it's called Lamb: The Gospel According to Biff, Christ's Childhood Pal. Um,
Okay.
and it's
Intriguing title, by the way.
it's totally fiction, but it's told a perspective of Jesus's cousin who grew up with Jesus, and it's really funny. Just one of the snippets, Jesus is killing this lizard, and it keeps coming back. He keeps bringing it back to life and killing it and bringing it back to life when he's a little kid. It's so funny. It's such a funny perspective on the Bible. So I mean,
Okay.
it's not gonna make you think or anything, but it's really funny. And
I love
I
it. I
think
need
you'd
light
enjoy it.
things here in my life. You can only read so many heavy things for so long.
Right? Laughter
So,
is healing. And two, I would just say to anybody that's out there that's, perhaps dealing with these challenges right now and wondering how to handle that, leave room for laughter, leave room for joy, make space in your life for the things that fill your cup. And especially if you are in an environment where you don't have a lot of support, there there is a tomorrow, right? There is another side of and you can build the life that you need where you do feel safe in every way. And
yeah,
I just encourage everyone who's in that moment, it's okay to be exactly who you are. You are beautiful and you are exactly who you're meant to be.
agreed. Amen.
Thank you guys for listening, and we're gonna be back in hopefully next week if Jay doesn't go lick telephone poles and get sick again.
Stop. Don't mock me. I have
And
issues.
Lance, we'd love to have you on again
Yes.
just as soon as we can for sure.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
happy to. But I do want to thank you both for creating this space because there is just something about hearing your experience and knowing how much I can relate to it. It makes me not feel alone. And I love hearing. So thank you for sharing your stories and creating this for us.
Oh, thank
It's
you.
Thank you.
it's it's a huge benefit to folks like me that have that shared experience with you. So thank you.
Thank
Awesome.
you. And
You're
same
gonna make
here.
me cry. Thank you.
Oh,
We are survivors and we have to stick together. So
absolutely.
that's awesome. Thank you, Lance. It's been great.
You too.
Right on.
Love you
Bye
both.
guys.
Thank you.
You
Love
too.
you.
Bye.
Bye.